When companies don't have a formal procurement process, purchasing happens in emails, Slack messages. There is no approvals, or approvals are happening post-purchase, if at all they happen. And your AP team is spending a lot of time reverse engineering to figure out who made the purchase instead of just processing invoices. Now, when you have a formal procurement process, finance team knows in advance on what is being committed for spending. Approvals are in place, vendors are authorized, and there are no more surprises and the month-end close process. Now, in the past few years, we have worked with hundreds of growing companies to help them automate their procurement process and kind of control the chaos while saving time. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through what is a procurement process, how you can implement in your company step by step, and how you can avoid any month-end close surprises. So let's get into it. So the first thing we're going to discuss today is what is a procurement process? Put it in simple words, it's the end-to-end process for acquiring a product or service, which starts from all the way to identifying why we need something to the time when you pay the vendor, right? So this entire process is what we call procurement. Now, you might say, yeah, there are different departments who handle this. So typically the buying part is handled by a buying team or a procurement team, and the payment part in terms of managing the invoices and paying the vendors is handled by accounts payable team. So here we are more focused on the process rather than who does what. So just wanted to clarify before we get started. Now, typically you see two interchangeable terms, purchasing or procurement. Purchasing means just focus on the buying part of it, right? So in terms of issuing the purchase order to the vendor, collaborating with the vendors on processing the orders, and so on. However, when you think about procurement as a term, it means the end-to-end process. So identification of need, why we need something, putting in a request process, getting approvals done, issuing the purchase order to the vendor, receiving the item, receiving the invoice, matching the invoice with the receipt, purchase orders, and so on, and paying the vendor. So you might heard these terms interchangeably, but think about procurement as the end-to-end process. Now, the reason this distinction matters for the finance team is if you do not have a formal procurement process, you do not have visibility in terms of where spending is happening. So without a formal procurement process, the spending decisions are made within the departments itself. Budgets overruns happens all the time, and finance team is constantly reacting to what is coming to them versus proactively planning for cash flow. When you do have a formal procurement process, everything goes through review and approval. You are making sure that you have budgets in place, so you're checking against those budgets so that when an invoice shows up, there is a matching purchase order to it, and you have already planned for that spending in terms of cash flow planning. So let's look at step by step what is a procurement process. I'm going to cover 8 different steps here, walking you through from start to end. So let's start for step 0, which is the need identification part. So every purchasing initiates from a need, right? So whether it's raw material that you need to purchase to manufacture the product that you're selling, or you probably need a new software to run the department more effectively. So the idea here is figuring out what do you really need to purchase and why. Now, the step 1 is the purchasing process, right? So purchase requisition. This is where somebody goes in and start creating a request on, hey, I need this. Why do I need this? What cost center it is assigned to, what chart of account it is assigned to, which budget it is assigned to, all that, right? So that is where you determine whether like a purchase, what is this need and why do you need really to make a purchase? Now, if you do not have a procurement system like ProcureDesk, you're probably doing this over emails, paper forms, and so on. However, if you have a system, it streamlines the capturing of that information. So it's one central place for you to manage all that. So that's kind of step 1 is the purchase requisition process. Step 2 is the review and approval of the requisition. So once you have a request filled in, now you need a process for reviewing and approving it, whether it needs to go to a department manager so that they can check their budgets, or maybe it needs to go to finance because it's a large capital purchase. It has its own kind of sub process, but it needs to go to finance first, or maybe IT needs to review all software purchase requests. So this is what you define in your organization as either a delegation of authority, where first of all, who can approve a purchase and to what amount, or you could also have these specialized workflows where it is being routed to different people, right? Or another next step here could be that it is going to procurement for further evaluation on who is the best vendor and so on. But here, keep in mind that the approval process would vary from company to company, but just keep it simple so that the right person can approve. So that's step number 2, which is approval. Step number 3 is optional, which is requesting bids from different vendors. So let's say you're making a large purchase. You probably are installing a new machinery in your facility, right? That is a large purchase, and that needs either a request for quote or an RFP, which is request for proposal. Essentially, in simple terms, what you're doing here is you're reaching out to the market to figure out who is the best vendor for the product or service that you're trying to purchase and where you can get the best value. So we'll talk about value in the next step in terms of what value means. Now, this step is optional. So what I mean is, let's say if you already have a negotiated contract with a vendor, then you don't need to go get quotes all the time. A very common example would be, let's say you have CDW as your IT supplier, or you buy supplies from Amazon or Staples and so on, where you do have a negotiated contract. In that case, you really don't need to get quotes. So this is again an optional step. Now, step 4 is comparing the bids that you have received from different vendors. Again, optional step, right? But let's say we go back to the previous example of buying large capital equipment. So in this case, you will compare pricing, delivery dates, warranty, post-implementation support, and so on, right? So here what you do is something called total cost analysis or total cost of ownership, TCO. So essentially you're running it through a end-to-end process to figure out, okay, if the machinery is going to be for 5 years, what is that total cost? And that is how you determine the best value. Now, if it is, let's say you were buying supplies for the first time, let's say MRO supplies or IT supplies, and you negotiated a contract with the vendor, then you will put it like a long-term contract in place and say, all right, we are going to purchase these supplies from you for the next 6 months or next 1 year. And here is our negotiated price. So that is the value of, doing it once and then keep reusing it. So now think about this. Let's say you have a procurement system now where you can put this catalog in, then people can simply pick and choose what they need to purchase. There's no need to send it out for bids all the time and comparing it and so on. But here you're trying to get the best value, not the cheapest price. So I just want to make sure I'm emphasizing this. Cheapest price is not, always the best value over time, because there might be initial cost, which is very low, but long-term maintenance cost or ongoing costs are very high. Step 5 is issuing the purchase order to the vendor. So a purchase order is a formal binding document between the buyer and the supplier that lists your terms and conditions, that lists the pricing, the quantity, any special instructions that you want to let the vendor know. So in this step is you're generating a purchase order and sending it out to the vendor. Now, if you're using a system like ProcureDesk, then this is automated. So once the purchase request is approved and the buying team has kind of selected the right vendor, the system issues the purchase order and automatically send it out to the vendor, right? So that is step number 5. Step 6 is receiving the items. And this is specifically for tangible products. For services, you might follow a different process where you are asking for confirmation and say, was the service performed at the level you were, looking for, and so on. However, for materials, it is a pretty straightforward process. When you receive a material, there is a packing slip which lists the content of the delivery. So all you're doing in this step is you're uploading that into a procurement system or filing it in your, filing process, whatever that is, in terms of here is what we received, what was the quantity, and then you go through like sort of an inspection process to make sure this actually match your requirements or you got what you ordered, right? So that is kind of the receipt process. Step 7 is invoice approval and matching. So let's talk through that. Now, so far what we have done is we have issued a purchase order to the vendor on what we need. We have received the product or service from the vendor. Vendor sends us the invoice. And at this step, AP team is trying to figure out whether this invoice should be paid or not. So what are you comparing in this? You're comparing, did you get the right price at which you ordered? Did you get the right quantity, right? So if the vendor charges more than what you agreed to pay, or they delivered more than what you actually purchased, there is a discrepancy. Now, a system like ProcureDesk can automatically match your invoices with purchase orders and receipts, which is called a three-way match, and automatically figure out those discrepancies so that your team is not manually looking at multiple documents and trying to figure out if everything matches out. However, if you're doing this manually, just go look for, hey, is the invoice matching the purchase order amount, the receipt quantity, and so on. And if everything checks out, the invoice is ready for payment. However, if it does not, then you need to have a process to route it to the right person to review. Maybe it's procurement for figuring out the price, or maybe somebody else in the organization who needs to work with the vendor to figure all that out, right? So those are some of the examples of price match. For invoice that is for a service and not material, you will just send that invoice to somebody in the organization to review, especially the person who actually is going to receive received the service or who's overseeing the project for them to confirm and say, did you receive it or not? So step 8 is audit and compliance and record keeping. So once a document is reviewed and approved, you need to keep a record of it for compliance reasons. When it was approved, who approved it, did it match your policies, the controls that you have in place, and so on. Now, for that, you need to keep very detailed document. For a system like ProcureDesk, it is automatically done for you because it captures all the activities that are happening in the system and who did it, when it was performed, and so on, which is very important artifacts for compliance and audit. ProcureDesk also syncs this information back to your accounting system, which is your system of record, right? So if you're using QuickBooks, NetSuite, Business Central, whatever the case might be, the data is already there. So if your auditors are looking at your just ERP or accounting system, they don't have to go look at another system for that. By the way, if you want to try ProcureDesk for yourself, click on the link below to schedule a demo with one of our product specialists. Now we covered what a procurement process is, but let's talk about what happens if you do not have a formal procurement process. So very common theme that we see across growing companies is there's no formal procurement process, which means spending is happening via email, Slack messages, and so on, or somebody's calling the vendor, which means there is no visibility into your committed spend in terms of how much are you going to spend, which causes two problems, right? Number one is your AP team has to spend a lot of time processing invoices, which we'll talk, but two is you can't plan your cash flow. So if you're running from one funding round to another, this becomes super important because you want to understand what's your committed spend so you can plan your cash flow and match it with your burn rate so that you're ready for next round of funding and so on. So that's kind of the main issue. We always see budget overruns in this case, or I would say heated conversation between different departments on what's really going on. So that means your AP team is trying to reverse engineering the process, right? To figure out when an invoice shows up, it doesn't have any document to link to or a purchase order to link to, which means I'm going to go now start figuring out who made this purchase, start reaching out to people, where this needs to be coded, and so on. So for your AP team, the simple process of processing an invoice, which should not take more than maybe a minute or two, becomes a 30-minute scenario, right? Because now you got to go chase people, figure out, get approvals, and so on. And it might be fine if you're processing 10 invoices a month, but if you're processing anywhere between 100 to 200 invoices a month, it's a lot of work. It becomes a full-time job for someone to just process invoices, which leads to third problem is if you don't have invoices approved on that all the time, or you have surprise expenses showing up, that means your month-end close process looks very long. Most of our times we see customers having a month-end process of 10 to 15 days, and with ProcureDesk, they're able to bring it to 3 to 4 days. But except the time savings, the main difference here is if you do not have a formal procurement process, you're always in that fight mode, right? Trying to figure out where all the invoices are, close the books, move to the next month. You never get the time to analyze how are we spending, where are we spending money, and so on. With a formal procurement process, you are able to manage all this in a more efficient way, which means you have more time to look at the analytics of or the patterns of what is going on with your spending versus just trying to close books. So how do you go about setting up a procurement system if you want to just automate your procurement process, right? Or if you don't have a procurement process. So step number one is document your existing process. How do you do things today, right? How do you process a request? Who orders? When do they order? What's the frequency of ordering and so on? What exactly are they buying and so on, right? So that is step one of documenting what's your current process. From there, you want to review what's a process that will reduce the friction from step 1 to step 2, for example, which is the approval process. So if somebody puts in a request, do we have a formal approval process? A request should be reviewed by somebody to say, okay, is this the right purchase? Is this from the right vendor? Do we really need it? Do we have the budget? Those are the things you want to capture in a approval workflow, but keep it simple. Don't create a workflow which has 5 steps, because then the entire process slows down and it defeats the purpose of putting a procurement process in place, right? Because people will not follow it. They will develop their own processes. So keep it simple. And number 3 is now, if you're automating it using a system like ProcureDesk, then you want to connect with your accounting system, because your chart of accounts, your list of suppliers, your classes or locations, it's all there. So why reinvent the wheel? So you want your procurement system to talk to your accounting system so that all the data can be pulled into that, right? So when somebody's trying to put in a request, they can simply select what chart of account it needs to go to, what class it needs to go to, or if you're using a system like ProcureDesk, you can automate a lot of that in the system itself using artificial intelligence. And the second thing is, once the data is created, like let's say you process an invoice in ProcureDesk, you match it to a purchase order, and receipt, it must go to your accounting system automatically. Because your accounting system is the system of record, the last thing you want to do is re-enter data back into your accounting system. So once you have all these things in place, this is how your process should work, right? So somebody goes into a system where they create a purchase request. Purchase request is then routed for approval to procurement, or maybe you need to get a code or something like that. Then a purchase order is issued to the vendor. It is sent to the vendor automatically. Vendor sends the product. You go and create a receipt in the system, confirm that it has been delivered. Vendor then sends you the invoice. Invoice gets automatically matched to a purchase order and receipt using automation. And then once invoice is reviewed and approved, you can sync it with your accounting system. You can pay the invoice using the accounting system, or you could use system like ProcureDesk to do bill pay and so on. So everything is in one single place, end to end. So if you want a procurement process that helps you control spending and put everything in place, click on the link below to schedule some time with one of our product specialists. What we will do is we'll walk you through this exact process, those steps I talked about, in how it works in ProcureDesk, right? All the way from need identification, purchase requests, approvals, purchase orders, receipts, and invoice matching and integration with their accounting system. Again, click on the link below to schedule some time with our product specialists. And if you want to know how accounts payable can be automated in Microsoft Business Central, check this video.